And historian Ron Romano is with us now. Welcome. It's nice to see you. We appreciate you driving all the way over from Maine to be here with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
You and other volunteers oversee that old cemetery in Portland, Maine, Eastern Cemetery, beautifully situated on a hillside in the city overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It's one of the oldest in Maine?
It is indeed. It's one of probably the third oldest, and we were established in 1668, so we recently had our 350th anniversary.
And what year was John Briggs buried there?
So he died in 1837. We were active for about 200 years, middle 1600s to middle 1800s. So he's kind of at the end of that cycle.
And you had seen John Briggs' faded gravestone through the years, but you really didn't think that much of it. There was nothing really that stood out.
Right. So we do a lot of tours there and bring visitors through, and we usually look for the unusual. And the reality is that Dr. Briggs' grave marker is kind of unremarkable. So I've walked past it probably 100 times, and I just never really paid attention to it until we found out that there was a story to be told.
And that came to light just about a year ago. You got an email in early 2020?
Correct, yeah. So I got an email from the Daughters of the War of 1812, and she was trying to help a family identify where Dr. Briggs was buried and whether there was a marker in his place. So one of the things I do for our friends group is do the research into these kind of routine questions, and so I picked it up from there, and little did I realize it was going to turn into a much bigger story.
I guess so. That set everything in motion, really.
Really did.
So Tammy Mansfield was the woman in Wyoming.
Correct.
She reached out to you. They wanted to just see if there was any sort of a war decoration already on his gravesite.
Right, and that was the purpose, really, I think, was she was hoping to be able to put a medallion, a War of 1812 medallion, at his gravesite.
So as they were doing that, you kind of took it on your own to check in to his past a little.
You know, I wanted to understand who this man was before we put a medallion on his grave. So I started the research into trying to figure out who he was and what his story was. And I kind of tripped upon a picture of him on the Ancestry website, reached out to the person who had posted that and said, "Is this for real?" Sometimes people put pictures that aren't really who those people are. And it turned out to be a fourth great-grandson of Dr. Briggs, and in fact it is a real image of him, and it's just amazing.
Stephen Stroud was the fourth great-grandson, and when you reached out to him, you found out that the family really had a trove of documents and archives about John Briggs.
That's right. Steve Stroud is one of many in the line, but he is the person who has sort of taken on the responsibility of collecting and holding the family memorabilia. So he had a treasure of documents, and he was so willing to share them with me and help me put the story together, and what a story it is.
And so he had the drawing. He also had a letter from John Briggs' wife, Dorothea.
Yes.
It was dated just 2 days after the Battle of Plattsburgh, where
Right.
she wrote him a letter saying, please
Right.
come back home to Maine.
Right. It's amazing that that has survived, but in fact, you're right. It's a letter that she wrote to him shortly after the battle. She's really begging him to come home because she doesn't know how she's going to cope without him. She's in Maine by herself, well, with her two children. Their two children who were toddlers at that point, and she needed him home, and she was worried about him, and you can hear it in her voice in the letter that she wrote.
Now, she's not buried with John Briggs at Eastern Cemetery.
Right, she's not. So she survived him by a number of years, and actually after he died, within about a year she remarried, and it was the family lawyer who she married. They were together for a few more years. He died in the early 1850s, and once she was a widow for the second time, she headed out to Illinois, where 6 of her children had already relocated.
So John Briggs is buried in Eastern Cemetery with a couple of his sons?
Exactly. At least 2 children are there. So John Briggs died in 1837. He was 45 years old, and he died of unknown causes. But he wasn't the first one in the family to be buried there. So a son named William had predeceased him by 5 years. He's in a plot a couple over from the doctor. And on Dr. Briggs' gravestone is actually his son Henry is memorialized as well. So the 2 names are on one stone.
So John Briggs did come back to Maine and was a doctor in the city?
He was, yeah. He had a medical practice. He was 23 when he was in battle, came back within a year and worked in his practice for another 20 years.
Stephen Stroud has some documentation of him describing what the battle was like.
Right, and it's just an amazing story. He was 23. He was responsible as the surgeon on the Saratoga. It was the largest. The folks here in Plattsburgh know the story well, but it was the largest of the U.S. Naval Fleet boats. It was a couple hundred men on there. And during that battle, almost 30 were wounded, almost 30 died. He did not have space below decks to do his work. So he was actually on the top deck trying to attend to all these wounded as the cannons and the shot are flying all around him. And in fact, he was wounded himself with a cannonball that came across. He and his assistant were lifting one of the wounded men onto the table to do work on him, and the assistant was killed instantly. And Dr. Briggs received a wooden splinter into his leg and ankle that basically was a lifelong injury. It hobbled him, created difficulty for him for the rest of his life. But the story here is that he, for whatever reason, we don't know if it was a selfless act or whether there was another reason, he didn't list himself among the wounded when he filed his report. And so years later, when he wanted the war pension, the country denied him the war pension, and it actually took an act of Congress 20 years later for him to be awarded that pension. And sadly, he only lived a few more months.
When you did the research into John Briggs, you wrote a paper and you showed some of the documents and the drawing that Stephen Stroud had, and included was a medical reference book. And that listed a description from him of the battle and the injuries?
Right, and sadly, that's the one document we know about in Briggs' handwriting that's not in Steve Stroud's family's collection. That was, we found it had been auctioned off on a private auction a few years ago, so it's in someone else's hands. It may be in a museum even, I haven't been able to find it. But yes, that's a journal in his writing, in his handwriting, and where he sort of detailed events of the day and named names, I think, of the wounded that he attended to.
And described how gravely wounded they were.
I mean, it's a great piece, and it's too bad that it isn't in the family collection, but they have such a rich collection. It's kind of okay that it's not there. We know about it.
As we saw, Stephen Stroud traveled all the way to Maine a month ago to place a War of 1812 medallion on his great-great-great-great-grandfather's grave. And now his first cousin, Dan Gibbs, another fourth great-grandson, and his wife Susie traveled all the way from Arizona for the ceremony as well.
Right.
What did it mean for the family after all these years to be able to recognize their ancestors' valor?
Yeah, they were really proud of him. I mean, they have a family story that they've known about. They didn't realize how rich the story was until we sort of worked together and put it all together for them. But the fact that they all made this commitment to travel from so many miles away to be there the day that we had the medallion placed, I think speaks, volumes. Yeah, it was great. It was a great day.
And how satisfying was it for you to see this recognition after all the research you did to help bring John Briggs' story to light, his heroism, his service to his country? And he was all but forgotten for so many years. Yeah. So now to see his story told again, to see the family 207 years later be able to recognize his service. What's that mean to you?
It means a lot to me. I mean, I love doing the research. And it takes a long time. I spend hours and hours and days and weeks and months doing the work. So when there is a story that actually comes to fruition in an event like we had and is meaningful to a lot of people, and we have the family there, it's such a satisfying end for me. And so I was really pleased with the day. I mean, I really loved it. And the paper is now out there so that it's available to the public to read, and so folks can learn more about it. Yeah, it's a great ending.
And how wonderful that visitors to Eastern Cemetery now in Portland will be able to see the marker at John Briggs' grave. And you give tours of the cemetery, so you'll be able to point it out and share his story.
The day after the event, the medallion event, I changed my tour route, and I now have Briggs on every tour. So yeah, I get to tell his story.
Fantastic. Yep. Does this also show the importance of the work that old cemetery associations do in Maine and in New York and really across the country?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, we have so many great colonial era cemeteries in New England and in the Northeast. And, budgets being what they are, a lot of them fall into disrepair. So we need people to, do the right thing, maintain records, and keep the place up, learn the proper techniques to make sure that the grave markers themselves and the cemetery landscapes are preserved, because these are great stories and we need to keep telling them.
They are great stories. 207 years after his heroism, thanks to you and your fellow sleuths in Maine, Wyoming, Texas, this remarkable story is coming to light. Another hero, a new chapter in the story of this historic battle that you have helped uncover and to write. Kudos to you, Ron Romano. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks. A pleasure being here, and I'm really happy that we have this new partnership between Plattsburgh and Portland.
We are too. A fantastic new story to share.
Thank you.